Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar, The Whole Brain Child, Revolutionary Strategies to Nurture a Child's Developing Mind with Dr. Tina Bryson. I'm Gina Carvalho, the Director of Communications for the Glendon Association and for PsychAlive. Glendon's mission is to save lives and enhance mental health by addressing the social problems of suicide, violence, child abuse, and troubled interpersonal relationships. Our website is www.glendon.org, and visit us on PsychAlive, which is www.psychalive.org. I just have a few quick announcements before we start the webinar. If at any time you have trouble with the audio on your computer, you can go to the top right hand of your screen and click the Use Telephone and follow the instructions. You'll be able to listen to the webinar on your telephone. You can type questions throughout the webinar for Dr. Bryson, and it's on the top, on the right hand of your screen, and we'll bring the questions in, time permitting, and if not, you can email questions to me, Gina, J-I-N-A, at glendon.org, and we'll forward those to Dr. Bryson. For CEs, you will be receiving CE information in an email within 2 days after this webinar, which will include a post-test to return, and then you will receive your certificate. And now I'm very happy to be introducing our guest presenter today, Dr. Tina Bryson. Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates in Arcadia, California, where she sees parents and children. She speaks to children, educators, and clinicians all over the country, and she has written for numerous venues, most recently for PBS series, This Emotional Life. She also co-hosts a web-based parenting program called The Intentional Parent. Tina earned her PhD from the University of Southern California, where her research explored attachment science, child-rearing theory, and the emerging field of interpersonal neurobiology. She is the co-author of, I just heard, a best-selling book from the LA Times called The Whole Brain Child, which she co-authored with Dr. Dan Siegel. And to learn more about Dr. Bryson, visit her website, www.tinabryson.com. And now I'll introduce Dr. Lisa Firestone, who will be conducting the webinar with Dr. Bryson. Enjoy the webinar.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. This is our contact information so that you can reach us if you need anything further from us at PsychAlive, and this is how you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. And again, this is the book that was authored by just recently by Dr. Tina Bryson, who we are very lucky to have with us today for this webinar. Tina, is there anything else you would like to say at this point? So, Tina. Tina? Hello? Okay, I don't seem to have Dr. Bryson. I'm not able to hear her, at least. So before we go on, we're going to try to figure out why that is. We're going to get Dr. Tina Bryson on the line next now, hopefully. Tina, can you hear me? Okay. Connected to audio. She's not muted. We're trying to problem solve here why we don't have Dr. Bryson on the line yet. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm not sure what the problem is, but we are going to wait for just a minute. Again, this is how you can contact Dr. Tina Bryson and find out about all the different activities that she's engaged in, where she's going to be speaking, her television show, and also about links to the book, The Whole Brain Child. Unfortunately, we're still having trouble getting Dr. Bryson on, but we are trying.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Tina, you're back on.
Okay, I've been here. I've been hearing you the whole time. I don't know why you haven't heard me, but I'm here.
Okay, well, hopefully our whole audience can hear you now.
Okay, good.
I think we've got it. I'm really a little bit frustrating. Okay, so Tina, why don't we go ahead and get started with the material since we had this little bit of delay. And
well, I'm so excited to be here, and I know for those of you who are listening, to carve out a chunk of time is really an honor, and I'm so excited that you're here with me. And I have you in mind as we're going through here today. There is so much exciting stuff that's happening all over the world in the research of interpersonal neurobiology, looking at the relationship between the brain and the mind and our relationships. And so I'm really excited to share with you today. The first thing I want to start with is something most of you may already know, which is that it's not just our genes that determine who we are. It's our experiences. And the exciting thing about that is, regardless of what our experiences have been in the past, we can have new experiences that can shape our brain no matter how old we are, no matter what kinds of experiences we've had. And so that's exciting as a clinician to know that, and as a parent or as a teacher or whatever capacity you're serving in as you shape the minds and brains of others, is that we can be intentional about the kinds of experiences that we provide people and we provide ourselves in order to continue shaping how our brain continues to develop and evolve. And something else you may know is this principle that Donald Hebb wrote about, which is that neurons that fire together wire together. So this is the idea that new associations can be created in our offices, in the backseat of our car with our little ones, in the classroom, and all of the places that we interact in all of our relationships, that we can create new associations among the connections in our brain. And because we are providing these kinds of experiences, we actually don't just shape minds, but we actually shape the structure and therefore the function of the brain. And so we actually, in a way, are architects. And that's really a powerful responsibility. And it's not just in our role as mental health professionals, but in any kind of capacity of relationship we're in with the people we love, that the experiences we have with people and the experiences we provide ourselves can change the structure and function of the brain, which is so, so exciting.
So now I'd like to open up a poll and ask you, how many of you are parents, teachers, clinicians working with children, or none of the above? Okay, hold on a second. We're about to launch this poll. We're getting there. Okay, we're going to give you a minute to vote, and we're going to have polls throughout the webinar, so just to let you know that we're going to be asking you for input, because that helps both myself and Tina really shape the webinar, so it's going to be the most helpful for you. So let's give you a second to vote, and when we get most of the vote in, we'll go ahead and share that with you. Okay, so it looks like 45% of you are parents, 9% teachers, 64% clinicians working with children, 64% clinicians working with parents, and none of you are none of the above. So, Tina, this is an audience that I think will really benefit from this webinar.
Yeah. That's really helpful for me to see, and I assume if you could, since I see those numbers are exactly the same, if you work with children, you work with their parents as well, and that's a really important part of the work that I do as well. I primarily see children, adolescents, and young adults, and like college-age students, and then, of course, I'm working with their parents, even the college-age students. And so what I'm going to be talking about with you today, and of course a lot of you are parents as well, and we've got some teachers, and actually if we're clinicians and parents, we're teachers as well. But what's so exciting is that as we talk about the strategies today and kind of the way that we really approach the work that we do, we're going to be talking about all of this kind of as we would teach parents, as we teach children, and as we teach ourselves. And so there's sort of 3 different points of looking at all of these same concepts. So this is going to reach everyone here, so that's really fun. So what you're looking at here is from a book that Lise Elliott wrote called What's Going On in There. It tracks the neural development, the brain development from conception through, I believe, through age 5 or age 6. So what she's showing here in this slide is basically looking at neurons. You see the dark areas that look sort of like spider bodies, and then you've got the long branches that are coming out from there. The clusters, or the dark parts right there that Lisa's showing you, are neurons. Those are brain cells, and then you see the connections reaching out. Well, so you see there's about the same number of actual neurons at birth, at 6, and at 14, but what looks really different is the connections. So what we're seeing there is at birth there are very few connections, but at 6, a lot of connections. And, you know, it's really cute. Those of you who have had a conversation recently with a 6-year-old know that everything is connected to everything. So one of my conversations with my, I have 3 boys who are 11, 8, and 5, and then of course I see a range of ages in my clinical practice. But a recent conversation with my 6-year-old, when he was, my 8-year-old when he was 6, was something like this: Mom, I really want to be Darth Vader for Halloween, but only if I can have one of those Darth Vader masks that will let me breathe like this. And Mom, that reminds me, I really want to learn how to go snorkeling, and you have to get me a kid-sized snorkel because the other one would be probably too big for my mouth. And if I get a snorkel and I get to go snorkeling, I really want to go snorkeling in Hawaii. Oh, and Mom, if we go to Hawaii, I really want to see the volcanoes. You know, so the whole conversation, everything's connected to everything, and that's actually what their brain looks like as well. And so this process from birth to 6, what's happening is what they call a blossoming process. And this is where the brain, like a tree would blossom, the brain, the connection to blossoming. And then you notice that in this slide here with the 14-year-old, there are less connections. People joke all the time that they're teenagers losing their minds. And neurally speaking, that's actually kind of accurate because they actually start losing, I believe it's 60 to 65,000 brain cell connections per second during their adolescent years. And this blossoming process, where everything continues to branch out and connect, comes to a peak at age 11 for girls and about 12 and a half for boys. And then a process called pruning takes over. And that's sort of what you see a little bit here in this slide of the 14-year-old brain, is that some of that pruning process has begun. Now, actually, pruning starts as early as 6 months of age, but it really goes into high gear during the adolescent years. And what's so exciting about this is, you know, as clinicians and as parents and as teachers, we can have a lot to do with what determines what gets cut and what stays. And so that's kind of exciting based on the kinds of experiences we provide for kids, because what gets practiced, focal attention and practice, gets stronger and stays, and what is not attended to and not practiced starts withering and dying. And so it actually, you know, you think less connections would be not so good, but it actually allows us to have a leaner, meaner, kind of more efficient brain. So it's actually a good process that takes place. It's really helpful to look at that because it really helps us kind of take a look at what it is we're influencing. So what you're seeing here is a description of, or we're going to be looking at a description of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So most of you know you have 2 sides to your brain. I sometimes make the joke when I'm speaking that if you don't know that, you actually may not have 2 sides. But the left and right hemisphere actually function really differently from each other. In the book, Dan and I write about how it's like each side has a mind of its own. They both specialize in really different things. Now, I do want to say, just for scientific accuracy, that what I'm going to be showing you here and what we write about in the book, Dan and I had this this real tension that we had to walk as we were writing the book, because we want to be very scientifically accurate, but we also want it to be practical, accessible, and usable. And so to walk that tightrope was challenging at times. And so know that what we're going to be talking about here and what's in the book is really a simplified version of what the science says. And if you really want to dive into the science, the hardcore, most current science on the right and left hemisphere, Ian McGilchrist's book, Lisa, do you remember, it's something like The Master and His Emissary, I think is the name of that book.
That's it.
Is that right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, yeah. So, we're going to simplify. Like, you can't, to say the right hemisphere is more emotional is not completely scientifically accurate because emotion actually resides throughout the brain and throughout the body. But the right hemisphere is more closely connected to our lower structures of our brain and our body, and so it's more influenced by that. So let's look at what the left hemisphere does. And Lisa just popped that first one up. It's more logical. So kind of the logic and reasoning that we associate. It's more linear. It likes to put things in order. It's linguistic, so it likes to use words. And then the last one is that it's more literal. So it really looks at what's in front of us and not so much the context. And the joke that Dan and I make is that the left hemisphere loves that it's 4 L's because that's very neat and organized. So that's what the left hemisphere specializes in. And it's actually really great that the left and right hemisphere specialize in different things because it allows us to do more. If both sides of the brain did the same things, we wouldn't be able to have such sophisticated capacity to do so many things. So now let's look at the right hemisphere and what it specializes in. It senses emotions. So there's our way of being more scientifically accurate. We're not saying it's more emotional. It senses emotion more. So it pays more attention to the emotional information. And it looks at the whole picture as opposed to just the small pieces. And it puts things in context. So it's looking at the whole idea of everything. The next, I believe, is that it's random as opposed to linear. So it looks more at various things out of order. It's nonverbal as opposed to linguistic. So, I actually say that for all of us, we all actually speak at least 2 languages. Our first language was that of nonverbal communication. And this is what is probably the most powerful. If someone gives a nonverbal message of anger, but they smile and say, no, I'm not angry, we're going to really believe the nonverbal signals that indicate otherwise. So this is really powerful. And it means a lot when we understand children's development around the right hemisphere, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so it specializes in nonverbal communication, both sending and receiving messages. Autobiographical memory. There is some evidence that shows that factual memory is more in the left, like when we ask questions, if we're doing the adult attachment interview, for example, or we're doing a clinical interview in our practice, if we're asking questions about history with relationship with parents or things like that, it may be that someone can remember their favorite television show or their favorite lunchbox, which would be more left hemisphere memories. But a sense of self and time would be more autobiographical, and that's what the right specializes in. Is there one more there, Lisa? I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, there it is. And it senses information from the body. Now, what's so important about this is that we actually need the 4 L's from the left, and we need these 6 things that the right hemisphere does. We need both of them. To live in just the left hemisphere would be to live kind of in an emotional desert. And when I'm speaking to crowds of people, I say, if I were to tell you a story about my son being born just using my left hemisphere, I wouldn't be able to use any facial expression. I would have to keep a really monotone tone of voice. I wouldn't be able to gesture at all. And I would have to have no kind of emotional texture to it, and it would be just the fact. So it would be like my son was born at 5:01 p.m., kind of robotic. And that would be really weird if someone talked about their child being born with that kind of robotic voice. But to tell a right hemisphere only story, I would have to mime my birth experience, which would not be attractive or fun for anyone to see. So it's really important. What's good about knowing about the left and right is that, at least I'm hearing a lot of static. Is that just on my end?
I'm not hearing it.
Okay, good. Then I can that's great. If it's not bothering anybody else, then I can get through it. So what's really important about the left and the right is that they're both really essential. But what we want to do is not live in the left hemisphere that's just in the left hemisphere that's like an emotional desert, or just in the right hemisphere that's like an emotional tsunami. And probably when you think about kids in your classroom or your own children or in your clinical practice, you can think about times where they're really saying that it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't even bother me. I don't care. And they're saying all these, they're kind of cutting off their right hemisphere. Or, on the other hand, they may be like an emotional tsunami, and they're not able to look at things clearly or logically. And so what we need to do is have these 2 sides work together as a coordinated whole. To be really focused on one or the other creates all kinds of problems. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. What you're seeing here is from Lou Cozolino's great book, The Neuroscience of Human Relationships. And what he's showing here is that there are these growth cycles that happen throughout childhood between the left and the right hemisphere. So the bottom, down by where the numbers are, is showing the right hemisphere growth spurts, and the top would be the left hemisphere growth spurts, and then those numbers across are the years of age. Well, what's really fun to see is, the right hemisphere, you can see, is growing, and actually is completely dominant. Actually, the right hemisphere is completely dominant until age 3 or 4. Some people even say until age 6. So this chart's not showing dominance, but I wanted to mention that. This chart is showing growth cycles. What's interesting is right where you see right after age 1, around 15 to 18 months, this is about when we see the first language explosion in children. And this is when we see sort of a huge growth of left hemisphere. So you see between like 15 years of age and 3 years of age, 15 months and 3 years, this is when children start learning the linguistic, that's when they learn all their words. And so this is a huge spurt of growth cycle or growth development in the left hemisphere. And around age 2.5 to 3 is also when they start asking, why? And that's a left brain question. Then, people talk about the terrible 2s, but those of you who are parents know it's usually closer to like the terrible 3s, and some people call them the effing 4s. 4 can be so difficult as well. Well, look here. Between ages 3 and 5, which is when we see the most dramatic tantrums and emotional reactivity, that is a time where the right hemisphere, or the emotional tsunami part of the brain, is having a huge growth spurt as well. If you look at Louise Bates Ames' book, she's the one that writes Your 1-Year-Old, and there's a book called Your 2-Year-Old, and there's one for each age. It's really interesting to compare this chart to kind of how she describes each age, because you can see there are these periods like between 5 and 7, they're much more logical, you see much more left stuff, and then around 7.5 or so until 11, there's much more of a right hemisphere growth spurt. And this is where they can get more sophisticated in understanding their body, like they start paying attention. Oh, yeah, I'm hungry, or yes, I can understand that person's making a face and what that means and those kinds of things. So this is really helpful. You also see that the growth curves become less and less pronounced, so they're not as severe. One of my theories is that, when kids, sometimes I get calls from parents and they say, my kid's so sweet and easygoing, but the last 3 weeks or so, they've just not been themselves, and I don't know what to do. And usually this is when the parents, we ask, like, is my kid sleeping enough? Is something going on at school? Or are they coming down with something? But they're just not quite themselves. And oftentimes what I find is when I tell parents, of course, I always ask questions to make sure there's not something serious going on. But oftentimes, within another 3 weeks or so, the child will return back to their sweet, typical, easygoing self. And I believe that, Dr. Brazelton, the pediatrician, talks about how there are periods of disorganization before reorganization. And this happens, you see, all the time clinically, that when someone is learning something new or a new coping mechanism, sometimes there can be steps of regression. And I believe that there are growth spurts and growth cycles in the brain that are smaller than these big waves as well. That there are these periods between 3 to 6 weeks where our children's brains are going through these spurts of development. It often coincides with a physical growth spurt as well. So this is an interesting thing to kind of keep in mind. So please, we can go to the next slide. So what we were talking about before is that these left and right hemispheres are really important. We need both sides of our brain, but we want them to work together as a coordinated whole. And when they don't work together as a coordinated whole, we can have all kinds of problems. And this is kind of a fun story to tell as an example of that. So what you're seeing here in this picture is a picture of the table of my son's first birthday party. And I get a little crazy. I get kind of neurotic when it comes to following a theme. All my birthday parties and all the parties that I ever planned have to have a theme, and they go through the invitation matches, the tablescape matches the favors, matches the thank you cards. It all coordinates. I'm a little neurotic about party planning. So what you see here is the first thing you may notice, or not first thing you may notice, but if you look just to the right of the cake, you'll see a piece of paper that has a number 1 on it. And this is a, yes, thank you. That's the invitation, and that's how this whole thing started. I found a little invitation, and it said little one with the giant number 1, and I thought it was so cute. And it had these little polka dots on it. So I told my husband, I said, okay, I found the theme for JP's birthday. It's going to be polka dots. And he said, polka dots that's not really a theme. And I said, do you want to plan the party? And he said, that's a great theme. I love it. So I kind of went running from there. So the tissue paper, around that big rectangular block there in the middle is, I found that at Target, and my friend made these chocolate number 1s to match the invitation, and they had little polka dotted ribbons. I found the place at Target, and those had polka dots. I even have a twister mat on the table as the tablecloth. So I just had polka dots going on everywhere. You can even see the candle on the cake has a little polka dot. Well, I went to the local bakery to order a cupcake cake. And you can tell, if you're not sure what that is, you can tell in the picture that a cupcake cake is a bunch of cupcakes that are sort of squished together and frosted as one whole cake. And it's great because you can just grab a cupcake and hand it to someone. There's no cutting or anything. But I went and ordered the cupcake cake, and I said, okay, I wanted to say JP on the cupcakes, and I wanted to be frosted white, and I wanted to have polka dots on it. Well, you can see already from the picture that they messed up the order. The first thing was they frosted it blue, which I did not ask for. They put that weird yellow and green piping around the whole thing, and of course it's in the shape of a number 1 because that matched the invitation. But the other problem was much more significant. So you can see that they took a literal translation of me saying I wanted to say JP on the cupcakes, and actually wrote JP on the cupcakes on the cupcakes. So this is kind of a funny story because I went to pick up the cake an hour before the party, and I saw it, and the first thing I noticed was there was a lot more letters on the cake because I thought it would just have a J and a P on it. And then I was like, where are my polka dots? And so I called my friend who's a party planner, and I said, I've got new frosting. You've got to come over and help me refrost the cake. The party's starting soon. And I kept trying to explain to her how they messed with the cake and how they had written JP on the cupcakes. And she just couldn't even understand what I was talking about because she's like, I don't get it. What do you mean it says on the cupcake? Like she couldn't get it. So she came over to my house, and she said, there's no way I'm letting you refrost that. That's so funny. And my husband said, let's take a picture because someday you'll use it in a talk. And now my sister actually calls JP on the cupcakes. It's become a nickname. And sometimes we do this on his cakes on purpose now. It's kind of just a fun little ritual. But and not that it's very educational, but there's just some others that only use their left brain literal as opposed to looking at the context of what someone might be meaning. And so there are some other cakes here I want to show you. And some of these are on cakerex.com, which is a funny website. This one's Best Wishes, Suzanne. Underneath that, we will miss you. The next one is Happy Birthday, Adam, with blue flowers. There's a whole book called Cake Rex that shows these Olympic rings. There's actually one that I've not been able to find a picture of, but it's a floral arrangement, one of those big wreaths for a funeral. And it said, beloved mother, we'll see you again down at the bottom, or down below, or something like that, which that literal thing was probably not so good to have at a funeral. So these are funny pictures, but they kind of show the idea of how important it is that we use both the literal linguistic of the left, but also the context of the right. Okay, Lisa, we can go on to the next slide.
Okay, we're going to launch the next poll and ask how many of you are familiar with Tina's co-author, Dr. Dan Siegel's work in interpersonal neurobiology. So give it just a second, and we will launch this poll. And we'll give you just a minute to answer and kind of see how familiar all of you are with Dan's work. Okay, we're going to go ahead and share that poll with you. Great. And so, Tina, 20, and for all of you, 20% of you said yes, very. 80% said yes, somewhat. And we didn't have anybody who hasn't been exposed to some degree of Dan's work.
That's great, because then I can quickly hit some of the ideas of integration and then go on to more of the practical application. So that's great. That's really good to know. Thank you. That's helpful. So then if you know Dan's work, you know the framework of interpersonal neurobiology and the whole concept of integration and how when we are integrated, we have different parts, so like the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, but they work together as a coordinated whole. And so the analogy we use in the book is it's not like a smoothie where everything is blended together, where there isn't differentiation, there isn't differences. It's more like a fruit salad where you have pieces of fruit that have their own individual identities, that do their own thing, have their own flavor, but they work together as a coordinated whole. So there's two sort of parts to integration. One is differentiation, and the other is coordination. So one of the ways that we can take the pulse of integration, and keep in mind that integration is not an arrival. It's a constant kind of ebb and flow state. We might be in a state of integration in one moment, and 5 minutes later we may be in a state of disintegration. So it's not something we can just achieve. But the way that we take the pulse of integration is we can look at chaos, rigidity, or both. And those of you who have heard Dan speak or have read his writings know that he talks about how all of the problems that we see, including even the DSM-IV diagnoses, are reflections of chaos, rigidity, or both. So we sort of talk about this river of well-being that if we hit the bank of chaos, that creates problems. We can think about that sort of as the right hemisphere tsunami. Or if we hit the bank of rigidity, or more like the left brain rigidity, those create their own individual problems. What we want to do instead is be in a river of well-being instead of up against these banks of the river. And when we do that, we see we are flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. So this is the FACES that Dan, you know how he loves acronyms. He talks about FACES. And this is really helpful because when we see that there isn't these things, flexibility, adaptivity, coherence, or things making sense, energy, and stability, then we know that we're not in a state of integration. And this is really a lens through which we can see what's going wrong. And it also then, what's so exciting is it tells us, it gives us an indication of what we need to do. So that's exciting. Okay. So let's talk about what this means. Okay, that's really helpful. We already know about integration. We already know about left and right hemisphere. Let's talk about what this means. So the first strategy in the book that Dan and I talk about is the idea of connect and redirect. And this is the idea that when someone is in like for instance, let's say they're having an emotional tsunami. If they're more in their right hemisphere, and it's in a state of disintegration, if we come at it with a left brain response with logic and lots of talking language, we're going to miss. I often tell a story when I speak about how my son was 8 or 9 at the time. My husband and I had put him to bed, and about 5 minutes later we heard him stomping down the stairs. And we looked at each other like, okay, whose turn is it to go deal with this? And I came on the corner, and his arms were folded, and he looked furious. And this was unusual for him. Usually he would stay in bed. And I said, what's going on? Where are you at? And I knew he was exhausted. He said, you never leave me a note in the middle of the night, and I hate homework, and my birthday isn't for 9 more months. And so, you know, my first instinct was to say, you're really tired, go back to bed, we'll talk about it tomorrow. And, you know, it's funny, there are a lot of books that talk about parents who distrust their instincts. Well, you know, my instincts really stink sometimes, and I think a lot of people do as well. And of course we need to follow our instincts sometimes. Sometimes we need to be aware that those aren't always, for our first instincts may not be the best approach. So anyway, what I realized in that moment, so that was my first instinct. My second instinct was to defend myself, which was to say, you know, I didn't know you wanted me to leave you a note in the middle of the night. I'm not a mind reader. How would I know that unless you tell me? And there's nothing I can do about homework. That's your job. If you have a problem, we can talk about it with your teacher. And you should be more grateful for the birthday party you just had 3 months ago. And, you know, there's nothing I can do to make your birthday come earlier. And to feel, you know, you can even hear the annoyance in my voice now when I talk about how I felt in that moment, how I wanted to respond, my instincts. But I realized in that moment, and I have plenty of terrible parenting moments as well, but this was a good one. So those are more fun to tell. I think my audience usually loves it when I tell my own parenting meltdown stories more. But But what I knew about this moment was that his left brain had left the building. He was not using logic. Things did not make sense. There was no coherence. There was some rigidity there. He was not flexible and adaptive. Again, like I said, there was no coherence. And so I knew that if I came at him with my left brain instinct, that it would hit an unreceptive brick wall. And he would feel like I didn't understand him, that I totally didn't get it, how unfair his life was, and he would have gone back to bed with his arms folded and probably would have been in bed for a long time before he actually fell asleep. So what I did instead was connect and redirect the strategy. And what I did was I connected right brain to right brain with him. And the way I did that was by using what the right brain specializes in. So you'll hear me in a minute when I tell you use actual words, but it's the tone of my voice and the tempo, so how I slow things down, and I use a lot of pauses that also connect here. So I'm going to use, so what I did was I just pulled him to me, and I wrapped my arms around him, and I didn't say anything for about 10 seconds, and I just took a big, deep breath. And his arms were still folded. He didn't want to hug me back. And I said, sometimes it's so hard to be a kid, isn't it? And I just waited, and I paused again for another 10 or 15 seconds until his arms dropped to his sides, and then eventually his arms wrapped around me. So this is a moment of connecting right hemisphere to right hemisphere. I'm using nonverbal. I'm using touch. I'm using my tone of voice. I'm using pauses. I'm using breathing. I'm using facial, a really nurturing facial expression, and the timing and the intensity of my responses. So this connect piece took about 30 seconds, and I had him right hemisphere to right hemisphere in a moment of joining. And then I said, I know it's really, really late, and I think we should get you back to sleep, but what you've told me is really important. Can I leave you a note in the middle of the night tonight? So when I asked him that, that's the redirect part. I'm trying to pull in his left hemisphere by doing some problem solving, by using some words that are more directed at solving the problem. And he said, yes, because when Luke was sick last week, you left him a note on the bunk bed, and you didn't leave one for me. So I was like, okay, there's something going on there that's real and authentic that if I had just said, you're just tired, go back to bed, I would have totally missed. And so I said, yes, I'll leave you a note in the middle of the night, and tomorrow can we talk about doing homework, and maybe we can plan the theme for your next birthday party, back to my birthday theme. So I said, let me tuck you in. I walked him back upstairs. I tucked him in. And from the moment he stomped down the stairs until he was back in bed, falling asleep, feeling loved, connected to, listened to, and falling asleep was probably 5 minutes. So this was much more effective in terms of integrating his brain. It was much more effective in terms of nurturing the relationship and having him feel heard and listened to. But it was also much more effective in getting him to sleep and getting him the sleep he needed in order to help him be more regulated the next day as well. So it was a much more effective approach and a much more loving one that also gave his brain practice moving from a state of disintegration into integration. Now, this strategy works fabulously for even adults. So what we're doing here is we're connecting with the emotions with the right brain before redirecting behavior or before redirecting problem solving. So we use the nonverbal comfort of the right, touch, tone of voice, facial expression, empathic talk, pausing, all of those things. But then we move to the left, solutions, words, planning, and logical explanations. Now, I teach this to parents all the time. And what's funny is sometimes they'll come back to me and they'll say it didn't work. I tried it and it didn't work. And I actually had a couple in my office a few months ago, and one of them had videotaped a tantrum that their son was having, and the mom was trying to comfort him, and the dad was videotaping, and then they switched roles, and this little boy kept having a meltdown, and they were like, look, we tried it. We said, we know you're mad. You want Daddy to eat your sandwich, and Daddy's not eating your sandwich. We know you're really upset, and they tried to comfort him. But there were a couple of problems, and then they would say, Daddy will eat the sandwich later. So there were two problems that were happening. One is, even though they thought they were connecting, it was the tone of voice was not really connecting. It was like, we know you want Daddy to eat your sandwich, but it was really annoyed, which is understandable. We all understand those moments. So I recommended, talk less. You're using too many words. Talk less. Take more deep breaths so that you can get into a good state of mind as you're adjusting your tone of voice. But the other problem is they move to redirect too quickly. And in the video, you can see, and I actually should try and get permission from them to use the video so I can show this in the future. But what happened is they would move to the redirect way too quickly, and as soon as they were doing the connect piece, the little boy was calming down, calming down, calming down. The minute they came in with the redirect, he would dysregulate again. And so it's not just a simple like doing a left brain rigid following connect and read. Now I can move to redirect. It's really, we have to really be attuning and watching the process about when the best timing is for this.
Yeah, it's really important.
It's really
that part about attuning, because otherwise the timing of these things won't go right.
That's right. That's exactly right. So in strategy number 2, and this is something probably you guys do all the time in any capacity that you're working with kids, is to help them tell their story. And this is for little T traumas and big T traumas, which is name it to tame it. And I know it's hard to read probably on your screen, but you can see in the book we have cartoons that go with each strategy. So you can see here, instead of dismiss and deny, the little girl says, I fell and hurt my knee. And the mom says, don't cry. It's okay. Don't be sad. You're fine. Just be more careful, honey. So, okay, so that sounds like a really nice empathetic response, right? But instead we're encouraging people to try and name it to tame it. And this is where we actually go back and retell the story. And so in the second example, the little girl says, I fell and hurt my knee. And the mom says, that can hurt. I saw you running and you tripped and scraped your knee. Then what happened? And the little girl says, Mommy came. That's right. I held you and rocked you. Do you feel better? The little girl says, yes. Do you want me to show you how it happened? The little girl says, yes. And so, as you know in your work, that when a lot of what we do is we go back and help create coherence or a coherent narrative and make sense of things. But this isn't just for big traumas. This is for little things that happen that are upsetting to kids. So when we go back and tell a story that makes sense of things, what we're actually doing is we're actually creating coherence through integration. Because in order to tell a story that makes sense, we have to use the left hemisphere that explains and puts things in order and assigns words to them. So, right, this is the logical, linear, linguistic, literal piece. But when we tell the story, we can combine the things that the right hemisphere specializes in, which is the whole context and the emotional information and the autobiographical information, even the bodily sensation. So in the book, we tell a story about a woman that had been taking my parenting classes, and her son had been in a car accident with his nanny. And the little boy was 3 or 4 at the time, and the mom got a phone call and arrived at the scene of the accident. And the little boy was being held by the paramedic, and the little boy kept saying over and over and over, Ia, io, io, bop, bop, Ia, io, io, bop, bop. And the firefighter or paramedic guy had no idea what the little boy was saying, but his mom knew exactly what he was saying, which was Maria, which was the name of his nanny. And io, io, bop, bop was how the noise he made for sirens. So what he was saying over and over was, Maria left in the ambulance. Maria's in the ambulance. And the little boy was fine, and the nanny was fine. What actually happened was the nanny had a seizure while she was driving. Unfortunately, neither one of them were hurt. But the mom's instinct was to just say, Maria's okay. We're going to go visit her. She's fine. You're okay. Let's go get some ice cream to help them feel better, right? To just kind of distract and comfort. But she knew, she'd been taking my classes, and she knew what we had talked about, which is that even from the time babies are tiny and little, they have a drive to understand. And, just like if you talk to your sister on the phone this afternoon and she said something mean to you, your brain would be like, why would she say something like that? And it would be really hard to just let it go. You'd be thinking about it and kind of perseverating on it, and then maybe eventually you talk to her and get clarification. But what happens particularly with children is they may not have the experience or the left brain capacity to really understand the why, to be able to put things in order, to create cause and effect lines to be drawn, to really understand the logic or the reasoning for things. So what happens is the right hemisphere is all fired up with the images and the emotions and the feelings and the bodily experience, but not be able to understand it. So what this mom knew was that if she just tried to, the problem with the kind of let's get ice cream approach is that his brain would continue to need to make sense of it. And so she went back and helped him retell the story. And when she would get to the part about, and then Maria had a seizure and her body started shaking, the little boy would actually physically shake and show what he saw when the nanny had the seizure. And can you imagine how powerful that must have been for him to be able to kind of reenact that and show that to his mom and allow it to kind of discharge and leave his, having all that power in him. And so they actually would tell the story frequently, for a few weeks, and then eventually, anytime they would hear a siren, they would go back and retell the story. But it didn't have the trauma thing to it at all because he made sense of it, and his mom was able to do this for him. Now, this is something I think parents you can do as early as 6 months of age. Your kid falls over and bangs their head. Oh, let's tell the story of what happened. You can have other children act it out. And this is, again, like a lot of what you guys do a lot in therapy or in the classroom. My son has a preschool teacher who does this. We had windstorms here in Southern California right at the beginning of December or end of November. And there was a lot of destruction and loss of electricity and all of these things. And the very next day that the children were back, my son's preschool teacher, who understands this stuff beautifully, spent the entire circle time going back and letting the children tell their stories and make sense of them. And this is so, so powerful. And it's really the science behind why creating a coherent narrative is integrating and why journaling or talking to a friend or experiencing therapy actually creates so much health and wellness and healing because it's actually allowing the brain to integrate. It's really, really powerful stuff.
Yeah, I think those stories really illustrate the point you were making, Tina, and I think it makes it really clear how you can do this with a child.
Absolutely. And I think, here's what you're seeing here is at the end of that section where we talk about right brain and left brain in the book, we actually had our illustrator draw a little comic strip for parents and for kids at the end of each chapter so that we can explain to kids how their brains work. I'm not going to read this now because you guys can see it and it's in the book, but this is the idea of your left brain and your right brain and how you have many different parts of your brain that do different things. And when we get upset, it's like a big wave washes over us, and it's hard to feel better. But once we talk about it and retell the story, it allows us to feel calm and happy again. So this is a way I actually explain this science to both parents and to kids. I actually pulled this out in my office.
So you actually use it in session. That's really helpful.
I do. Yeah, I pull it out, and I read this with them. And then, especially particularly if I have a parent who feels like what we're doing is indulgent. Like if the kid's upset about something, that's happened at school, or if the kid's kind of perseverating about something, the parent maybe thinks that we may have a parent that thinks the child's being manipulative, or the child's milking it, or the child is just get over it kind of thing. And so this actually helps parents understand, too, the science behind what we're doing as therapists and why it's so important in terms of what's happening in the brain.
Mm-hmm. So it makes it more understandable for parents, and they can be more compassionate.
And I have a patient I'm working with now who at times one of the ways that she is resistant in therapy is that she just won't talk. On her worst days, she climbs under the table and puts her hands over her ears so that she can't hear me talk either. But this is really helpful for her too because as I show this little girl Annie here who's sick and upset, we sort of talk about it's a way for her to kind of understand that what we're doing is really important work and that we're helping her brain understand what's going on with her as well. So it's really helpful to use with kids.
Okay, so we're going to launch another poll and ask how many of you think you could use these strategies with children, either the children you teach or the children that you are doing therapy with or your own children for that matter. So we're launching the poll, and we're going to wait until most of you get to vote, and then we'll share it with you. Okay, with most of the vote in, we 100% of people say that they could do this. So this sounds really good, Tina. I think you're getting it across.
It's really fun. You know, I was doing a parenting consult with a dad who had raised a bunch of kids, and then he had a new marriage and a new baby, and his baby was 2 when I was helping him, and his next child up was like 12 years of age. And so he was really feeling like things had changed, and he wanted some help. And we were talking about how anytime his child would get upset, his main thing would be just to distract her and make her laugh. And I was like, well, that's really sweet. And then I showed him this cartoon, and he totally revolutionized how he was doing things. So I think it can be really helpful. So that's great to hear. I'm so glad to hear that. Okay, so when it comes to this right and left integration, so here's where it talks about kind of 3 different points of entry on here. So we've been talking about how we can use it with kids. We've been talking about how we can teach this to parents and how parents can respond differently when their children are having emotional meltdowns or when their children are being really rigid. But one of the ways that I am constantly thinking about for myself and that I'd like to challenge you, whether you're a parent, a teacher, or a clinician, is that are there times when you feel like you maybe use left brain approaches when you should be using right brain approaches, or vice versa? And thinking about your own development and what's uncomfortable for you, or where do you tend to go when things feel uncomfortable? And you know, I'm a fairly green clinician. I've just been doing it for a couple of years. And one of the things that I'm constantly working on and being aware of myself is that sometimes, like here's a very specific example. One of my patients now is a 16-year-old who has a very rigid defenses in a relationship. And we've made great progress. She came in starting by saying, you know, everyone thinks I'm defensive, but I'm just annoyed because, you know, I'm not defensive at all. I'm just annoyed because they think I'm defensive, which makes me defensive, you know. And as we started peeling back the layers, now she really does see and admits that she is defended. And we've talked about why she has those defenses there and how those have been adaptive for her and really good, but now they're sort of imprisoning her and what steps she wants to take. So she's very left-brain, very shut down when it comes to really connecting and being vulnerable. And there was a moment in therapy a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about something, and I noticed her lip just barely quivering, and she started to get emotional. She started to cry a little bit, but she was holding it back. And I noticed I started feeling really uncomfortable. I actually started in by really saying, I was talking about something, and I just kept going. I was really explaining things to her, explaining the brain, explaining some other things to her. And I realized, you know, a little bit into it, oh my goodness, there's a moment here where her right brain is totally in the is in the process. You know, we've got a moment of really having the right hemisphere open up and be here. And here I am coming at it with my left brain. And I started noticing that I was feeling really uncomfortable, I think, for 2 reasons. One is I knew that I needed to switch then to this right brain and really be present in that moment. And I know that I tend to be more left brain. And then I started feeling uncomfortable because I knew what I was like. I had this instinct that I was misattuning. And so that discomfort made me realize, okay, I have this moment here. I need to move and be more attuned and move to a place of really honoring her right brain here and allowing her to be there in that moment and really practice being there and allow that to be safe for her without switching her back to the left, because my left brain is just screaming and taking over. So that's just an example of thinking about where if the person we're working with needs more development in their left brain or more development in their right brain, are we allowing that to happen by being aware of that and creating those experiences?
Right. I think that's such an important example because I think that's a struggle for all of us doing clinical work. And I wanted to ask our audience, which of you, which do you consider yourself, more left brain or more right brain? And come on, launch this poll. I'm getting it. Always technologically challenged. You know, which do you consider yourself, more right brain dominant, more left brain dominant, like Tina was talking about, or pretty balanced, you know, where you feel like there's a pretty good balance? And we're going to wait a minute to give most people a chance to vote. One person once asked me with these polls if we were just making up the numbers because they came up pretty quickly, but actually the webinar software does calculate them, so we actually are sharing real results with you.
That's great.
And if you're doing this, watching this together as a group, you might want to designate one person as the poll answerer, so you'll get your answer in time. But basically what it looks like, Tina, is we have 18% of people saying they're more right brain dominant, 18% saying they're more left brain dominant, and then the remainder, about 64%, saying that they see themselves as more balanced.
We've got an integrated crew here on the line.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to keep in mind too is that, you know, just like integration is a state that can be changeable, there may be certain things that we go to right or we go to left. You know, just as a quick personal example, there was a period of time where one of my sons was very ill for quite a long time, and we couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and it all ended up okay. But after a while, you know, after it was like a year and a half that he had these stomach aches, and after a while I had just total empathy for Steve. And, you know, he would be like, Mommy, my tummy hurts, and I'd be like, okay, well, go get in the bath, that'll help your stomach relax, and I'll bring you up some ibuprofen, you know. And I would just go into this total, instead of it be like, I'm so sorry, it hurts, honey, you know, what he needed from me. And so I found for a while, and even now still, that was just a year ago that we finally figured out what was wrong with him. I still find myself, when it comes to, like, health things with my kids, that I can jump to it, like, that sort of becomes a danger zone for me. So there may be particular issues that trigger you to move to right or move to left. So that's good to keep in mind, too, that there may be particular things that pull you in one direction or the other and move you out of integration.
Yeah, I think that really helps, because if you think yourself as just fixed in being more right brain dominant or left brain dominant, that probably isn't the case.
Yeah, that's rigid, right?
Right. That would be rigid thinking. You're right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is the Whole Brain Kids cartoon that is at the end of the chapter of implicit and explicit memory. And those of you, I know you guys are familiar with Jan's work, so you are familiar with this idea of implicit and explicit memory. But this has been a really powerful cartoon that I've used in many sessions as well, related to the idea of telling a story that makes sense. So this is the idea of pulling the pieces of memory together, that our brain remembers things but not always as a whole. And so when we go back and retell the story, it can allow these implicit pieces to become explicit, because as you know, our kids, you know, whether it's the brain is an association machine. And so when someone's had a bad experience with something, it becomes linked with things related to it in those moments. And so we can actually recreate new association, allow the implicit memory to become explicit through our coherence making and through our storytelling, and sometimes, you know, through play therapy and other nonverbal approaches of making sense as well. But this is a really powerful cartoon to kind of help kids. Like I have a patient I'm seeing now who's this really calm, cool, collected kid for the most part, but for some reason, every time he plays tennis competitively, he completely turns into John McEnroe. He starts throwing his racket, and he just completely gets really, really upset if he's not winning. And so we were trying to make sense of that, and you know, we related it to some of the anxiety he was feeling and different pressures and how he feels embarrassed at times, and we did a lot of sort of cognitive sense-making. But then we were able to kind of pinpoint a moment where he was really embarrassed when he lost one time. There was one particular incident. And so then I was able to teach him about how that became, you know, this kind of losing in a match and having all of this kind of flood of being embarrassed and people thinking he's not good, and then people maybe not wanting to play with him, you know, play tennis with him, or not wanting to pick him as a partner. All of these things got associated. And he didn't realize that was still affecting the feelings he was having in the moment. And so this is a cartoon I actually read to him that's in the book about a little girl who had a bad experience with dogs when she was little, and that even now when she sees friendly dogs, she would still feel afraid, and that now she can understand, oh, those feelings that I had come from that experience. And so now, you know, there's this great, it's a part of it is in the book, but my son was terrified. He had a really bad experience at a swimming lesson when he was 5. And so when he was 9, I was taking him to swimming lessons one day. I said, we're starting swimming lessons today. And he said, I don't want to go. I'm not going. And I said, what's going on with you? You know, why are you so upset? You love swimming. You're a great swimmer. You have fun swimming with all your friends. And he said, I still want to go. Do I have to go? And it was like this little panic took over him. And so I knew, you know, there was implicit triggering happening. And so I said, do you remember that place that we took swimming lessons? And he remembered bits and pieces of it. And I said, your brain is so amazing because your brain's job is to keep you safe. And so when I say going to a Dodgers game, how do you feel? And he said, I feel excited and happy. And I said, what about when I say, you know, going and riding bikes at the park? How do you feel? Excited, fun, let's go do it. I said, but what about swimming lessons? What happens when I say swimming lessons? And he immediately said, I don't want to go today. Do I have to go today? It's like he couldn't even go to my question because he became flooded and preoccupied with the idea of having to go fearful. And I said, you know, sometimes when we feel afraid, and I do this with kids in my clinical practice as well, sometimes when we feel afraid, it makes sense that we feel afraid. If I told you to go get on a motorcycle and ride down the street as fast as you could, it would be normal that you would feel afraid because that would be a dangerous, scary thing to do. But you know how to swim, and you love swimming. So does it make sense to you that you would feel afraid when I say swimming lessons? And he said, no. And I said, well, guess what? Do you remember that place? And we went back and retold the story. And I said, I think your brain is stuck. Your brain is saying swimming lessons is a bad idea, and your brain is trying to keep you safe because of that experience. I said, but that was 4 years ago. You're a new kid. You know how to swim. You're a really good swimmer. You love swimming. So do you think these feelings are coming from that time? And so we sort of made sense of it. And I never used the words implicit memory or explicit memory with him, but I just talked about how does your brain feel when I say this. And so then I was able to say, okay, those feelings are coming from the past. So now you can talk to your brain and you can say, brain, thank you for trying to keep me safe. You're worried because of that bad place, but I'm a different kid. I'm not going to that same place. I already know how to swim, so I don't need you to feel afraid anymore. And so he had told me he had butterflies in his stomach, and so I said, well, now, you know, if you start feeling afraid again, is there something you can say to yourself to remind yourself that those feelings are from the past and they don't have to do with now? And so he came up with the phrase, kill the butterflies. And I said, well, that's kind of violent. Can you come up with something else? And he liked that. So we stuck with kill the butterflies. But that's really, really a powerful tool to use, especially, you know, kids have fears, like they heard toilet flush and it was really loud and it was scary. And you have kids that come into your office that have phobias about things because they may have had an experience. And, you know, what's good to keep in mind, too, I had a mom call me, a friend of mine, who was like, I don't know what's going on. My daughter won't go back to school, and I can't figure out why. She was a 4-year-old preschooler. I can't figure out why. I asked the teachers. They said everything was fine. They can't figure it out. So I actually talked to the little girl, and as I started kind of exploring with her, we realized that she had a bad dream. And her dream seemed really realistic to her, and it was this dream about something really bad that had happened at school. So it might not even necessarily be grounded in reality, right? But sometimes we can have these associations that get linked in our brain from something we hear or from even a dream. So this is a really powerful tool as well for that.
Yeah, it sounds really helpful. So it's figuring out what it was that was the original trigger.
Yeah, and sometimes we can't figure that out, you know. But we can talk about how the brain feels or how the brain and the body feel when this particular idea or subject comes up. And then we can say, okay, now we can talk to our brain and say, thank you for, you know, helping me think about this and be safe. But now we're going to have a new narrative, a new story for our brain.
Okay, I'm going to launch the next poll, which is how many of you are working with people who have trouble with memory integration? Let me give you a chance to vote. Okay, and with most of the vote in, we're going to go ahead and share that poll. And Tina, about 50% of people said yes, and about 50% of people said no.
Okay, good. Well, this is really, that's really good to know. And I think this is the idea of integrating, you know, things that have happened in the past and making sense of them and going back and retelling that story. So So we've really focused a lot here on the left-right integration and the idea of storytelling and creating a coherent narrative and using both sides of our brain ourselves and teaching parents about their own approaches, not just coming at their kids from one side or the other, and then also teaching kids about this. And, you know, this is, I wish we had time to get into it today, but this is all very, very much tied into attachment science and how our brains are wired in relationship, and how the narrative that we have when we talk about our attachment histories or our relationship histories, that it really reveals to what degree the left and right hemisphere are integrating as we tell our story. So that's a really interesting, if you're interested in learning more about that, Dan Siegel's book, Parenting from the Inside Out, is a really great place to start. And he and I also have written an article, which you can find the link on my website, or you can just Google it, PBS This Emotional Life. We wrote an article about that. So that's a really helpful thing to think about as well. But now we're going to turn our attention to another type of integration, and that is looking at, we've talked about kind of left and right. Now we're going to talk about kind of the top and the bottom part of the brain. So we're going to go more vertically now as opposed to horizontally. So one of the things that happens when we're a parent or a teacher, particularly, not so much a clinician necessarily, is that we see a kid, our own kid or someone else's kid, that's sort of what we think of as a problem kid, or a kid who's really, like, difficult. And then clinicians see parents who bring their kids in who are like, gosh, they're having all these issues, or there are these major problems, or the school told us we have to get help, or whatever it is. And one of the things that I love so much when we think about the brain really changing from experience is to think that when kids are struggling, whatever the issue is, it's an opportunity to change their brains, to change the structure and therefore the function of how their brains work. And so when kids are struggling, it's like they're yelling loud and clear, I need to build skills in this area. I need help developing the ability to, you know, regulate my emotions, or to make sense of something, or to control my behavior, or whatever it is. And so this is such a powerful way to shift, especially, you know, one of the things you may hear a lot from parents is their own struggle in discipline. And so this is a really nice framework to think about that as well, is that when our kids are showing behaviors that are not what we would like to see, they're communicating to us, I need you to teach me how to do this behavior the correct way. And so that's really what discipline is anyway, is teaching. So let's talk about this type of integration more in depth now. So the issues that you may see a lot with your students, your own children, or your clients, patients, are problem solving or decision making. So this is the idea of rational problem solving, considering consequences, and thinking before acting. And sometimes these are major issues that you see in all kinds of kids of all different ages. Let's see what else we see. We may see problems regulating emotions, regulating the body, or controlling bodily impulses. We may see problems with empathy, or obviously lack of empathy, and personal insight. And that's not the next one. Sorry, planning and executive function. So stopping, thinking, acting, and reflecting are all sort of part of that. Looking at all of our options and making the best choice. Having personal insight, or the ability to reflect on something and understand more about why we did what we did, how we tick, what our tendencies are. Facing our fears, being willing to try something new or try something again. Being flexible and adaptive. And then morality is on this list as well. There's actually a few more things that could go on this list, but these are issues that we see a lot with issues that we see presenting all the time with kids. And some of these are developmentally normal, right? So, 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds, a lot of, those are developmentally typical ages to have difficulty regulating emotions, regulating the body, and those get better and better over time. Lots of times, it's not unusual for kids to have trouble with these at certain developmental ages. So we have to look at this in the context of development. And I'm sure a lot of the work you do is similar to the work I do, which is a good portion of my time is spent telling parents, that's what a 3-year-old does. That's developmentally normal. And your child being what they call obstinate, or your child, challenging you or not obeying, or whatever words they use, that's your child's developmental task, is to differentiate. And so we sort of normalize some of these things. But as you know, sometimes things are outside the realm of what's developmentally typical. And so these are some of the issues that we see. And the reason that we see these issues, both typically and non-typically, is because the brain is still developing. So you can see in this picture here where that fire is kind of a disturbing image, but what you're seeing there is a little area of the red and the orange and yellow. This is an area of the brain called the middle prefrontal cortex. And since you know Dan's work, you know he talks about this part of the brain a lot. This is the very frontmost part of our frontal lobe. And what's interesting about this is when you think about babies and how they develop physically, first they learn to hold up their little necks, then they learn to kind of sit up and hold up their torso, and then they learn to kind of move their arms purposefully, and then their hands, and then eventually they get their little Cheerio pincher grasp where they can pick up their little Cheerios. So physical development, and then eventually they learn to, crawl and then walk and use their legs. So physically, development happens or advances from the top down. But the brain actually is the opposite. It's from the bottom up, back to the front. So this frontal lobe, the very frontmost part, kind of behind the orbits of our eyes and our eyebrows and our forehead, this middle prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain to develop. And as most of you know, it's actually the mid-20s before it's done developing. And from the time that pruning occurs, like I said, which really starts happening dramatically at age 11 for girls and 12 and a half for boys, until 25, this part of the brain is under massive reconstruction. And it actually explains why even really smart, responsible teenagers do really dumb things sometimes, because that part of the brain is under construction, so it's more vulnerable to not working during times of high emotion or stress, which for teenagers most of the time probably. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So these issues we see these issues frequently because the brain is not yet fully integrated. And so, there are times, if the brain is not fully developed, it's going to be vulnerable to not being integrated. And so what we see here is, Dan and I talk about sort of the idea of an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. Now, you guys are probably familiar with the typical kind of triune brain, where you talk about the limbic area and the brainstem and the limbic area, and then the cortex. So you see those different parts there. But to simplify and make it more accessible, Dan and I just talked about the upstairs brain, which is the cortex, particularly the frontal lobe, this middle prefrontal cortex that we just talked about. And the downstairs brain would be more the limbic area and the brainstem, which is the more primitive part of the brain. So we can talk about, the reason we use this analogy, and if you can go to the next slide, is that the downstairs brain, the downstairs of the house is typically where the most basic functions, most basic things are. That's where our kitchen is. That's where we live primarily most of the time in terms of, basic things, our more primitive operations like laundry and cooking and those kinds of things. But the upstairs is where we have more perspective. We can kind of look out and see things more clearly. So you can see this is where we do more planning and imagining, and this is where, we can regulate ourselves more and make good decisions. So when it comes to the downstairs and upstairs brain, a lack of integration can cause a lot of problems. So if we're only operating out of our primitive brain, that can be problematic. We act like reptiles. But sometimes we get cut off from our lower primitive brain that tells us all kinds of important information about our emotions and bodies. So neither one of those is good. It's like the left and right. We want them to work together as a coordinated whole. So we want to build the staircase of this house to allow the upstairs and the downstairs to be one integrated thing. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So what happens then is when we have a period of time where we get really angry or really fearful, our amygdala, which is part of the limbic area in the downstairs brain, kind of hijacked. And it's almost like a baby gate gets locked at the bottom of the stairs and doesn't allow us to use that upstairs brain that allows us to regulate our emotions and regulate our body, attune our communication to other people, have insight, have empathy, make good decisions, plan ahead, all of those things. So what happens is we have these intense emotions, impulsive reactions, and rigid and repetitive responses where we act like little reptiles sometimes. And this is sort of the science of what can happen with tantrums. I'm not going to talk about that today, but when I talk to parents, I'll talk about that on the next webinar. This really explains a lot of tantrums that our children have. It's like their primitive brain has taken over, which is why I'm so against parents ignoring a tantrum, which is what sort of the common thinking is. Mm-hmm. Because our child is really actually in emotional distress. They have cortisol pumping through their little bodies. And if we ignore those moments where they're losing their minds, they're having a meltdown, it'd be like ignoring them if they were physically hurt. And so we need to give our kids the message, and we need to teach parents this, that when our children are at their absolute worst, that we can take it. We are there for them, even at their absolute worst. So just being present with them and saying, I'm here, do you need help calming down? And sometimes not talking, but just being present is really, really powerful. Okay, so we see this in adults as well, right? This kind of, here's this little cartoon here. But what happens when we are, when our downstairs brain becomes disintegrated from our upstairs brain, then we can act primitively. Or like I said before, the other way around, where we just live in our kind of upstairs brain, but we're not tuned to our more basic gut emotions and things like that. Okay, next slide.
We have a poll of how many of you are working with individuals who are struggling with regulating their emotions, and I'm going to launch that poll and give you a second to answer. Christine, I think this is really important. This issues around emotional regulation seem to be an issue for most of the people that I work with in one way or another.
Yeah, and what happens is sometimes it's really systemic in families, right? It looks like we're getting a lot of people saying that this is an issue. It's systemic, 100% there. And I don't know if you guys find this in your work, but I do. I was working with a boy who was the most emotionally dysregulated kid I had ever met. And he had a long history of, he had in utero drug and cocaine and alcohol exposure. He was in and out of 11 different foster homes by the time he was 4. He and his brother were finally adopted by a couple who just wanted them so much and who were so excited and who are, for the most part, very loving parents. And this kid did have some organic issues because of his trauma history and his brain exposure, or his brain's exposure to these substances. But one of the most important interventions I had for this kid was having his mom go to therapy, because she needed to learn how to contain herself. She was so reactive. And this was a hard kid to parent. I totally understood her reactivity. But she needed to really build her upstairs brain, because anytime things would escalate or he would get dysregulated, she would completely go bonkers, and she had no capacity to regulate her own emotions. And so that sent him through the roof. And so so here we have mom who's like a right hemisphere tsunami with an upstairs brain that goes offline during these moments. And, of course, that's what's happening with the son. And the dad was completely overwhelmed by it, so he would totally check out. So he would totally go to his left brain and totally go to his upstairs brain. So it's like they made up one integrated brain, as a family, but individually they were kind of all over the map. So sometimes we have parents who are really dysregulated as well. For good reason. We understand that,
Right, it's understandable, but they still need help with it if they're going to be more effective with their children.
Absolutely. So as we're thinking about this, is when our kids are having when we see kids who have this emotional dysregulation, we can think about this, okay, great, this is an opportunity for integration. This kid is showing me where they need to build skills. So when we can look for what are the triggers or what are the skills that are lagging. And I love Ross Greene's work. He wrote several books, but The Explosive Child, Lost at School are two of his books that I love. He actually has a book for clinicians and as well that really looks at his collaborative problem-solving model, and he's fantastic. But he talks about this. What are the triggers for the problem? And this is not to say we just come at things from like a CBT approach. We're not just problem solvers. in terms of looking at, just changing our thinking or those kinds of things, but really looking at what are the specific areas of the upstairs brain that this kid is lagging in, what are the specific skills, and then what experiences can we provide to intentionally wire their brain for these skills. And so how do we know how to do that? I'm going to tell Sarah's story in a minute, but let's go to the next slide so we know how is it that we can actually give kids practice developing this upstairs brain. So this is the idea of neuroplasticity. So let's find out how much people know about neuroplasticity.
Right. So we're going to launch this slide just to see how many of you are familiar with neuroplasticity, and then we'll share that and let Tina explain more about it for us.
So as you guys are voting, one of my favorite books about neuroplasticity is Norman Doidge's book called The Brain That Changes Itself. Okay, good. So everybody knows at least some. I hope I'm not boring people. I hope I'm not saying stuff that everybody already knows.
Tina, I don't think this material could be covered too much for any of us. So I really appreciate it, and I think it really adds, practical skills, and particularly the stories that you're sharing, whether it be about children that you've known or children you've worked with and parents you've worked with. I think it's really helpful for helping us translate what we might know into actual practice.
Good. So, in a minute I'm going to tell you about this girl, Sarah, that I worked with, and of course that's a fake name, but so when I see a kid come into my office, or my own kids who are showing me that they're having trouble when they're upset with their brother or with my husband or me, expressing their emotions in a way that's not hurtful to someone, or, whatever it is that I'm like, oh gosh, we need skill building here. I go back to these ideas of what changes the brain. How do I know how to give these experiences that are going to rewire this brain or to build this brain? And so when we look at the laws of neuroplasticity, what is it that makes the brain change? Mass practice, doing it over and over and over again. Novelty, so doing it from a new way. And this is huge. I talk about this with parents all the time, especially in the context of looking at having parents do things playfully. So if a parent comes to me and says, I can't get my kids to do anything I say, they won't brush their teeth, they won't get in the car seat when I tell them, whatever it is, they won't get their homework done without a huge battle, and I just end up screaming and yelling because that's the only way they listen to me. We talk about this idea of novelty, which is the brain pays attention when something's new. So I talk about how one of the ways to keep a kid in an integrated state or get them into integrated state is to use novelty with playfulness. So I can say something like, I'm glad you're not going to get in the car seat today because my imaginary friend Sally is sitting in there, and if you sit on your car seat, you're going to sit on Sally, and she might start screaming and crying or something, and then I'm going to have to do a silly dance to calm her down, and, it's just going to be, and by then my kid's giggling and climbing into his car seat. So, that's a silly example, but anything we can do like that, like our kids are working on their homework, they keep having meltdown, you're like, okay, I have a new strategy. You're going to do 5 problems or 10 problems or whatever, and as soon as you hit the end of the page, we're going to blow up a balloon, we're going to play Keep It Up while we listen to one song, and then we're going to go back and do 5 more problems, whatever it is. So novelty. Okay, focused attention. So we use our attention, like Dan said, we use our attention like a surgeon uses a scalpel. We focus our attention. We show it in a new way. We practice it over and over, and that allows us to unlearn the old way. We do that by practicing. And then, of course, sleep and exercise help. And that's why when parents come into my office before I see their kid or before I do much of anything with even the parents, one of the first sets of questions I ask is about how much sleep the kid is getting. Because lots of times just adjusting how much sleep the kid is getting makes a lot of the problems reduce quite a bit. And a lot of kids are not getting enough sleep, so that's an important thing to know. Okay, so I want to tell you about Sarah. So Sarah came to me. I won't tell you her whole history, but since the time I saw her when she was 9, and she had been having panic attacks since the time she was 6. And there's a long history of all kinds of things, but that doesn't necessarily need to be gone into here. What happened was she had been seeing a therapist for about 1.5 years, and the therapist moved, and so the therapist was familiar, had been taking some of my classes, and was familiar with Dan's work, and so she sent this little girl on to see me and started working with her, and she had been having these panic attacks very frequently. It wasn't unusual for her to have probably 5 panic attacks in a week. She would have them at school. She would go into the bathroom and have them at school. Her mom traveled a couple of days a month, and when her stepdad was taking care of her, she would still have panic attacks, but she would do them secretly in her room. She didn't want him to know that she was having them. So when the mom and the dad came in, the dad was like, look, I think the mom totally indulges her, because she doesn't have these, when I'm taking care of her, and we kind of uncovered some of that. So I worked with Sarah for a while, and she had some health issues and some other things. She had some abandonment history with her biological father, all kinds of things. But she was having these panic attacks, and she did have tremendous anxiety. And what would happen then is she would start to feel anxious about something, and she was one of those kids who was a perfectionist. Everything had to be just so, and if she had a project coming up, or if she wanted to start her homework immediately on Friday afternoon, even though she had plenty of time over the weekend, she just had a lot of anxiety, particularly around school. So anyway, so what would happen is she would have, as soon as she would start having a lot of anxiety, she would have a panic attack. So I did a lot of different things with her. We worked on creating a coherent narrative around some of the abandonment issues with her dad. We did a lot of making sense and implicit-explicit integration, left-right integration. And, of course, I also was teaching her some coping thoughts and some things for her to help regulate herself. I taught her about her left brain and her right brain, and how when she started to feel anxiety, the emotional tsunami was like a big wave coming over her, and how she could use words from her left hemisphere to name it, to tame it, and calm those down. I also taught her when she was falling asleep at night, when she was totally relaxed and calm, to put her hand on her chest and apply just a little bit of pressure over her heart. And I had her do that for a month before ever doing anything else with it. And then I taught her that her brain has now associated a totally calm, relaxed state with this feeling of having her hand on her chest. So I taught her all these coping thoughts about arguing with the worry bully on her shoulder, and we had all these little tricks and things we had talked about. So one day she came to see me, and she said, this was about 3 months after I'd been seeing her, and she said, I have the best news, Tina. And I said, what? And she said, I stopped myself from having a panic attack yesterday. And it was the first time since she was sick in 3 years that she's been able to stop herself. And I said, how did you do that? Tell me how you handled that. And she said, well, I realized that I had forgotten my lunch. And it was almost lunchtime, and I started feeling really, really anxious. And she said, I started to panic a little bit. I started to say, oh, no, everyone's going to know I forgot my lunch, and I'm going to be hungry, and then I'm not going to be able to learn, and I'm going to be embarrassed, and so all those worry thoughts, right? And she said, and then I just remembered that I could argue with the worry bully. And so then I started arguing back and saying, well, I can just borrow some money from my friend. She always has extra money. Or I can just share a little bit of lunch, and then when I get home I can eat something. And so she started arguing with the worry bully, and then she put her hand on her chest to kind of, we've got this, her brain has created through mass practice and focused attention this kind of cue to relax her body and taking these big, deep breaths. And so she said, I did it. And when I did that, I didn't have a panic attack. And I said, what did you do? And she said, I relaxed and I had a good day. So I drew what you saw here in this is actually from my session with her. And I said, well, when you go down a sled, you're up on the top of a hill, and before you always had anxiety and worry, and it's like you got in a sled and you went down the same path and you had a panic attack. So every time you feel anxiety and worry, and it would get bigger and bigger, you would get in that sled and you'd go down that same hill over and over and over again, and you kept having a panic attack. And then the more times you did that, the bigger and bigger and deeper your path got. But what you did yesterday was you used coping thoughts and you used your breath. And what did you do? Your sled went over a little bit on the mountain and you went down a new path. And when that happened, you relaxed and you had a good day. And so then this was such a moment of celebration. And what we have here is basically a diagram of what happens with neural plasticity as well. So I said, look, before your brain connected anxiety and worry and panic attack, and that connection got really, really strong in your brain. But yesterday, you made a new connection in your brain. And the more you make that, the more you do that, the more you use your thoughts and your breath and all of these things, and you don't have a panic attack, that path is going to get really, really strong. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the snow will keep falling and cover up that other path. And your brain will have changed, and you've taken the first step to having a new brain. And so that was such an exciting way to explain the concept of neuroplasticity to her and to her parents. It was really powerful.
Right, and it really shows that you could teach these strategies or this understanding even to a fairly young child, a 9-year-old.
Absolutely. And so basically what we were doing here is we were having insights, right? And we were problem solving, and we were coming up with all of these strategies and plans. And so we were developing her upstairs brain. We were developing integration and rewiring the brain. So she had these repeated experiences. So this is kind of leading up to strategy number 3, which is the idea that when we exercise upstairs brain with mass practice, with focused attention, making sure our patients are getting sleep and exercise, and we're explaining things to them in novel ways and explaining their brain to them, we are changing the brain. And so the way we want kids, we've talked to parents about this, teachers and clinicians, is that when we provide repeated experiences where we're emphasizing empathy and insight, we're reflecting with them, we give them practice doing things the right way. We build resilience by kind of being more like coaches as opposed to just saving these kids and rescuing them and removing the obstacles. And then, of course, when we promote secure attachment relationship with them as their parents, as their clinicians, as their teachers, that actually builds the upstairs brain as well. And these are all super exciting ways that we can transform the everyday challenges that we have as opportunities to integrate a child's brain in both in the moment, that's sort of the survive part of the book that we talk about, but also thriving into the future. And there's nothing more important we can do than to be intentional about how we're wiring their brains. And so this whole brain perspective allows us to be integration detectives to help us move kids from places of disintegration into integration by the experiences we provide. And what's so cool about this is as we do this intentionally with kids, we're actually moving more towards integration ourselves. And so the last thing I want to end with here as we've run out of time is that what we do matters profoundly. As a clinician, I feel humbled. This little girl, Sarah, she was doing so well for a while. This picture I showed you, and I was feeling so like, oh, I'm such a powerful, amazing clinician. And then she went into this major regression, and I won't go into all the details of that, but she actually had been on some medication as well, and the medication made her psychotic, and there were all kinds of things going on. She regressed for a short period of time, and then she took off and did wonderfully. In fact, she didn't need therapy anymore. I was able to terminate my relationship with her. But during that time, I sometimes felt so vulnerable and so ineffective as a clinician. And we're humbled by our children and our students and our patients all the time. But even if we don't know the right tool, or we don't know what kind of integration we're working towards, or we don't know exactly what we're doing, just the nature of attuning to them, being present with them, and forming a relationship with them, just that alone wires their brain in beautiful ways. And so then when we can also add in the things that we're talking about from the whole brain perspective and the tools that we've talked about today, then it's even more powerful. So I know it's discouraging, but what you do matters so much. And then here's a list of some good resources here as well for you to look into for the future.
Right, and you're going to get a copy of this PowerPoint, so you'll have these and be able to look at these in more depth. And again, just wanted to remind you that the book that Tina, where she lays out all of these strategies, is The Whole Brain Child, that she wrote with Dan Siegel. And I think it's just been an invaluable book to me for recommending to parents and really anybody working with children in terms of, really being able to think more reflectively and with more insight about what it is we're doing and the impact that we're having on developing a child's brain. And Tina, I want to thank you so much for being with us here today and for offering the wisdom that you've shared that I think clinicians and parents and teachers alike can really make use of in terms of working with children and with parents for that matter, and with themselves for that matter, because you really targeted all three. I want to let people know that you are going to be doing a webinar with us that's really aimed at parents, and this is a free webinar that's going to be happening on Tuesday, February 21st from 11 to 12. If you'd like to learn more or register, please come to our PsychAlive website, and we would really be happy to get you registered for that. And again, I think if you're working with parents, whether you're a teacher or a clinician, I I think it would really be helpful to suggest that they might want to attend that. And again, that's a free resource that Tina's making available. And we also have other upcoming webinars going on. Ones that we're doing for professionals include a webinar about the fantasy bond in romantic relationships, and also one about suicide, what every mental health professional needs to know. And then we're also going to be doing free ones for the public on those same topics, and also on how to raise emotionally healthy children. So if you want to hear more about these webinars that are coming up, please feel free to, again, contact us at PsychAlive. And some ones that we're going to be doing for professionals is CE webinars with guest lecturers. Going to be one with Dr. Sheldon Solomon, and also one with Dr. James Gilligan. So if you're interested in subjects of the impact of death awareness on how we lead our lives, please tune into the one with Sheldon. And then the one with James Gilligan will really focus on the subject of violence. And for each of these, we'll be doing professional ones for CEs and ones just to educate the public as well that are free. So again, if you have any more questions, please feel free to contact me at the Glendon Association or at our website, PsychAlive. And then lastly, to receive your CEs for this webinar, upon completion of the webinar, you will receive an email with an evaluation form for you to complete and return to the CE provider, PER, Psychoeducational Resources. This form can be emailed, faxed, or mailed. It can be emailed, faxed, or mailed in the mail. Instructions will be given in the email. And recording of this webinar will also be available online. Those unable to attend this live webinar may view the recording and complete the evaluation form to receive 1.5 CEs as well. That costs $35 like it did if you were doing it live, for those of you who are with us. And a link to this recording will be sent to you as soon as it is available. So I hope you found the webinar helpful, and we look forward to hearing your feedback about that. And again, I just want to thank Tina for being here with us today, and it was really enjoyable to spend this time with you.
Thanks, Lisa. I enjoyed it as well.
Great. Okay, so we're going to now officially end the webinar.
Bye. Thanks so much.